Welcome, everybody, to the first edition, the first episode of the Black Male Study Sessions with Dr. Tommy J. Curry. This is going to be an ongoing weekly session that we're going to be doing, basically focus on the issues and plight of Black males and Black boys. I wanted to put this together because Black men and boys are normally talked about, they're talked to, they're talked at, they're talked down to, but very few people in the academic space or in the media influencer space really want to get into the meat of why Black men are dealing with the things that we deal with and how we got here. So this is the purpose of this series of talks. This series of talks is sponsored by the African American Men's Historical Society. Go to amhis.org to learn more. And tonight's subject is hidden victims of domestic violence. According to data from the U.S. National Crime Victimization Survey of 2019, men make up about 20% of reported intimate partner violence victims. Studies from the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey of 2024, however, suggest that the actual proportion is most likely higher, with men less likely to report due to social stigma, fear of not being believed, and traditional expectations of masculinity, often discouraging men from reporting abuse by partners. Underreporting is also tied to a lack of trust in support systems, as services are often geared toward women. We just saw a recent episode where we see the way that plays out in pop culture with the situation with sprinter Sha'Carri Richardson and her domestic violence incident against her boyfriend in the Seattle-Tacoma airport. Some of the responses that I got from that, some of the responses that I saw kind of tie into what we were talking about, we're going to be talking about tonight, because you had a lot of women saying that it wasn't really that serious. And surprisingly, a lot of men said that it wasn't really that serious as well. And it's something that we should overlook and just play it down and don't even worry about it. So I wanted to have a conversation about the hidden victims of domestic violence with Professor Tommy J. Curry. And if you don't know Professor Tommy J. Curry, you really need to get into his work. He is the personal chair of Africana Philosophy and Black Male Studies in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Edinburgh. He is the editor of Black Male Studies, a series exploring the paradoxes of racially subjugated males at Temple University Press. He's the author of Another White Man's Burden, Josiah Royce's Quest for a Philosophy of White Racial Empire. And also, and probably most of what you're most known for, he is the author of The Man Not, Race, Class, Genre, and the Dilemmas of Black Manhood, winner of the American Book Award. Dr. Curry, how are you this afternoon?
I'm doing well, sir. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be able to come in and have this conversation. It's important.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, brother.
All right, so let's get right into it. I started off the show by saying that Black males are the unseen victims of domestic violence. How did we get here socially? How did we get to the point where the abuse of Black men and Black boys is seen as something to be ridiculed or even just ignored altogether?
Well, I mean, there's a huge historical antecedent to the erasure of Black men and boys. If we go back to the late 1800s, when they first start writing about Black men being dangerous, it was used as an argument by people like Samuel Cartwright, who suggested that Africans were so violent towards women that they would line the streets of Africa with their skulls. Now, this idea was held by most ethnologists as well as suffragettes. So, in a way, the condition for white women getting the right to vote over Black men, at least as reflected by people like Susan B. Anthony and other feminists that were writing in the Revolution, was to depict Black men's freedom as enabling Black men to have dominion over Black women and beat them. They suggested that this was something that Black men had learned from slavery. It was part of their racial trait of brutality, and it was something to be feared. Now, the irony of this is that during this period of time, Black men were not actually allowed to beat their wives. And for some people, they may ask, well, how does that make sense? The history of racism in America is so irrational that when you look at how Black men were treated, there was this right to discipline one's wife called chastisement. And it was based in the notion of patriarchy, that said that men were the head of the household and they ruled over the women and children. So when black men became emancipated, what they did, especially in the southern states, was they made black men's rights to chastise their wives illegal. So if a black man was accused of beating his wife during Reconstruction, he would lose the right to vote, he could be put in jail, or he could be lynched. In fact, if you read Ida B. Wells's The Red Record in 1895, she lists several cases of black men being lynched for wife beating. Now, one of the pieces of chastisement was that you could do no physical injury to the woman because that was considered barbaric. But if a black man was even accused of trying to chastise his wife, he was lynched. It's important for this to be understood because it shows us that going into the 20th century, black male victims of domestic violence was never thought about outside of the risk that they posed to women. And because they were not considered real men, they were persecuted for any attempt of trying to run households. That meant that the black household, by definition, and we saw this coming into the early 1900s, had to be thought of as matriarchal. Now, when you get to 1910, the situation changes because rather than trying to justify why black men didn't deserve the ballot, white sociologists and ethnologists were trying to ridicule black men for not being real men. So starting in 1910 all the way up to the 1960s and 70s, they ridiculed black men for being victims of domestic violence. They wrote about it intensely in ethnographic accounts of the Negro, especially in the South. So you had people like Howard Odum in 1910 saying that jealousy of the black woman was the reason that black men would be killed. You had black sociologists like Charles S. Johnson knowing the role of jealousy in courtship relationships where women would kill men if they saw them with other women. In fact, when you go to 1955, you had people like Wolfgang and Farrakouti, who were the developers of subculture violence theory, actually noting that one of the first things they noticed in their study of Philadelphia was that black men were more likely to be victims of intimate partner homicide than their female counterpart. And that was written in the 50s. So the idea that black men have not and are not victims of domestic violence is a very recent phenomenon that didn't happen until the take up of the Duluth model in the 1980s. And this is what's really important for us to understand. Most of the conversations that I've seen online that talk about Sha'Carri Richardson take a Duluth model, a pro-feminist view of how men have power over women. And because we're not historical thinkers, we somehow think that that's the natural case of the world, that men have always abused women. But that's not been the case for black people. Remember, before you get to 1982, you have literally 70 years of research by white sociologists and other social scientists saying that domestic violence is a racial trait. That because black people were less evolved, black people would beat or abuse each other because they could not have strong nuclear families and did not respect marriage. Now, think about that for a moment. From the 1900s all the way to the 1980s, the predominant view on domestic violence amongst black people was that it was a function of their racial passions, their subcultural passions towards violence, their jealousy, and their lack of nuclear families. When you fast forward to when white women start writing theories about this from an activist space during the shelter movement, black men became erased. So when domestic violence against black men could be written about, like in Tally's Corner by LeBeau, or even as early as 1937, when you're looking at John Dollar's work in race, class, and caste in a southern city or a southern town, they had no problem showcasing the victimization of black men because they used it as evidence of racial inferiority. When you fast forwarded to a feminist view in the 1980s, those men became erased because even though people like Ellen Pence were writing about and cited people like Marvin Wolfgang, who had done the Philadelphia study to show that black men were victims, they simply ignored that evidence when they wanted to say that women were the predominant victims. And it's important to note that that theory, that argument, comes about predominantly on the basis of white women they interviewed in Minnesota. Black people weren't even involved. They never took black experience seriously until it became an issue that they were locking up more black women and black men than white people by rate because they were criminalizing wife beating or battery. So part of the invisibility of black men today is not based on the evidence. It's based on these kind of racist tropes that both started at the turn of the 20th century and continued for the need of theory and activism under white feminism. And people don't like to really have this conversation because every time we talk about what we say in the gender-based violence, we want to make it an issue that is already intuitively associated with female victimization. But not every group, not every ethnic and racial group operates on the same pattern that you find in white groups. So they debated the question of whether or not white men and white women had bidirectional violence or whether or not their rates were symmetrical. When they did the very first study in 1975 of domestic violence on white couples, they found, in fact, that white women slightly abused white men at a higher rate. So through their whole history between family violence scholars and feminist scholars, they're debating the issue. Is it an issue where you look at women's victimization in shelters, or you look at population studies? What we find when we go out and ask people who are victims. When it comes to black people, we don't do population studies. We don't because we're not the ones with the resources that allow us to do that research. So for whereas white people have these long debates from the 70s all the way to now based on evidence, most research on black people is based in feminist literature that simply articulates disparity as a function of patriarchy. So when you say, well, why do we not have research on black male victims? Why can we not talk about black male victims? Well, it's because we have one particular lens. We say domestic violence is caused by patriarchy and male dominance. Among white populations, they've disputed this over and over again. They show that it's bidirectional. They show that it's symmetrical. They show this even when they interview women who abuse to say that power, control, coercion are something that women use to justify their abuse of men. But when it comes to black men, the racial stigma of believing that black men are fundamentally violent has never been questioned. So now when we see something like Sha'Carri Richardson, now when we're looking at all the evidence of black male homicide at the hands of female perpetrated violence, we have no explanations. And we actually believe that we're somehow being progressive because we deny black male victims. And this is despite the fact that black men have showed up in practically every survey, be it NCVS, which is crime statistics, or the CDC's NISVS, which was started in 2010, that followed from the Violence Against Women survey that was in 1995-96. Black men have always shown up as equal to or slightly greater, at least in 12-month prevalence, of experiencing domestic violence victimization compared to their female counterpart. We're denying the evidence because of ideology. And it's extremely dangerous because we keep seeing the rise and the victimization of black men and women. Right? The thing about it is black men are being victimized alongside black women because we're talking about violent relationships. And we're denying the facts because I guess we want to become popular on the social media. But the evidence just doesn't support the idea that black men are absent or that this is a new phenomenon. We've been knowing about this for almost 100 years.
I'm glad you brought up the data because I want to get into a data point that you mentioned in your work, and would love to hear you expound on this. You talk about the 61-31-8 rule when it comes to IPV numbers, and that's a statistic that I wasn't even aware of until I read your work. So for the audience, can you tell everybody what that means exactly?
Well, so within any population, you have different kinds of intimate partner violence. The 61, when you talk about black people, or black Americans specifically, is the reported rate of bidirectional abuse. So the majority of bidirectional abuse, or the majority of domestic violence among black people, is bidirectional. This means that there is a conflictual relationship, usually involving high levels of verbal and psychological abuse that escalates into physical abuse. It could be non lethal, that can ultimately escalate into injury. It's a combative situation where both parties, men and women, could be both perpetrator and victim at different times. The 30 or 31 statistic is the relationship are the situation of female to male perpetrated violence. So the second greatest occurrence of violence in the black race is female to male perpetrated. Now, the majority of that violence is non-lethal, but it leads to injury. The 8% is the male to female prevalence of violence, right? So that's saying that, look, if you're saying, well, what's the rate that black men abuse black women? It would be 8%. It's the smallest. But because it's male initiated, it has the risk for the greatest injury. Now, when you look at the etiology of domestic violence among black people, you see this statistic reported in both primary literature and secondary literature. So I want to be very clear. When you study patterns of domestic violence among black people, you do not find any evidence of unidirectional violence. What that means is you do not find a data set that says only men are attacking women or only women are attacking black men. You're going to find some kind of dynamic that's usually going to involve mutual conflict. When you do look for a unidirectional pattern, as I said, that is more likely to be female initiated. But what we only talk about, and I think you've seen this in the commentaries. I think Mark Lamont Hill's commentary said this, and there was another brother who was talking about the need for a double standard. I forgot his name, but he was
That was
replying
Ryan
to
Clark.
Charlemagne.
Ryan Clark.
Yes, he was replying to Charlemagne. Um, they're focused on injury. And and I think I said something a little earlier about this on Twitter because that's such a dangerous standard. When we talk about domestic violence, we're not just talking about physical injury. We're talking about patterns of psychological and verbal aggression that negates the selfhood or personhood of the victim. So we understand this quite well when we speak about female victims, that a woman can be financially abused where a man takes resources from her, that a woman can be psychologically abused where a man negates her, tries to control her, etc. But we have a very, very hard time imagining that men are victims to that kind of dehumanization and that kind of coercive control. So what ends up happening is that when we have conversations about men, we say, especially if they're black men, right? Because white researchers are making this argument. People like Elizabeth Bates, people like Denise Hines, people like Emily Douglas, they make this argument on behalf of white male victims in the United States and the UK. But when you talk about black men, no one wants to contextualize the kinds of conflicts they have in relationships where they're being physically abused, they're being psychologically abused, they're being ridiculed and negated, and then how that escalates to conflict. When the black people talk about it, we only want to talk about injury. So we don't care if a brother's been abused. We don't care if he's been slapped. We don't care if he's been intimidated with knives and or we don't care if the police have been called on him. These are all forms of coercive control that we find in the literature regarding men and specifically black and ethnic minority men. But we ignore all that because we want to focus on, well, what happens when it escalates, right? And a good example of that would be the way that we talk about the Ray White situation. So we see both of them talk about being raised in environments where they saw abuse, where this was normal for them, where they've practiced abusing each other right throughout their relationship. You see her attack. I believe she spits on him, scratches him, etc. He escalates. Alcohol, of course, is involved. Alcohol is a major correlative factor in how in black people escalating and causing injury. She gets knocked out, right? The only focus is on that. When we consider injury, we have to think about how black men and women are exchanging violence with each other. We don't, in order to stop injury of a woman, you have to stop the premeditated conflicts that lead to the escalation. So by erasing black male victims, you're saying that we're completely fine with cycles of violence, negation, and aggression happening, as long as it doesn't end up in hurting a woman. That's not going to decrease violence in our communities. The criminalization of domestic violence and the removal of men from homes has been going on since the 1980s. But our rates of domestic violence and even severe domestic violence, or what's often called intimate terrorism, still remains higher than practically every other racial group, including whites. So the tactics and the strategies that we're using to discuss these issues as well as the policies that are being enforced, do not decrease violence in our communities. And we've continued to have the wrong conversation by people who are pundits that don't study domestic violence, rather people who are trying to figure out how ecological theories that are trying to link up things like poverty, neighborhood segregation, alcoholism, trauma, previous childhood abuse, how these things can be lessened to decrease violence in our homes and against men and women overall. We've been irresponsible with it. And because black people don't have the kind of intellectual and theoretical diversity in the literature that we see with people that are studying white populations, every pundit comes back to the same thing. Black men are masculine and hyper masculine. Black men are oppressed. Hence, they compensate by beating women. These are all theories that have been disproven or not had any evidence to begin with. So, for us to educate the public about domestic violence requires us to not only dig into the statistics, but to try to understand how cycles of conflict are being enabled by us denying that men are victims and that the kind of victimization that goes on in households are actually socializing children into violent patterns that they're going to reproduce as adults.
Dr. Curry, you talk a lot about some of the analysis and some of the information gathering that goes into some of these studies. And you also talk a lot about the Duluth model, and you talk a lot about the flaws
Yes.
in the Duluth model. Can you explain what the Duluth model is? Can you explain why it's a bad system to aggregate a lot of this data?
Well, the Duluth model was basically the model that was created by two advocates, two women's advocates that were frustrated that the shelter movement was not saving as many lives of white women that they thought that it should. So I want to be very clear. Like when you read any of the early works from the 1980s about domestic violence, you know, people like Schechter, for instance. You will find them discuss how shelters were funded in the 1970s, but they weren't being utilized because white women with battered white women would go back to their husbands. In the 1980s, people like Michael Panmar and Ellen Pence said, well, we need to have police remove women from their husbands so they don't go back to them and put them into shelters. And the way they did that was on the basis of interviewing groups of women from Duluth, Minnesota, asking them about their experiences of domestic violence with their husbands, and then using that as the model to influence criminal justice solutions to domestic violence among whites. The mandatory arrest policies and practices that got taken up during that period of time are a direct result of the Duluth model. And part of their slogan was that men abuse for power, men abuse for control. Their view was that because they lived in a patriarchal society, and you can actually read this in their book, right? They wrote a book on the power wheel. They're very clear about this. They say, listen, you know, the same way that, you know, you have a racist society that uses lynching and murder, for some reason, these second wave feminists always compared everything to black people. Use lynching, murder, and segregation to enforce discipline on black people. It's the same way that white men specifically use domestic violence to enforce control of power over women. They weren't really interested in racial variations of domestic violence. They were specifically interested in white women, and they're very clear about that kind of dynamic, right? So over time, and you know, Ellen Pence actually writes a great article about this in 1993. She says, "Look, you know, these women came in. They said, I feel like when I'm abused by my husband, he gains control over me, right, and he gains power." And Ellen Pence says, well, look, you know, as we kept working with advocates and activists, that became part of our slogan that he abuses for control. He desires power when he abuses women. And that became, as she says, as she refers to it in her article, this became part of the jingle. So this view of domestic violence had people or was based on the idea that patriarchy causes domestic violence, that women are always victims, and if women do abuse men, it's because of something the man did. So it fixated in our mind, right, that female violence is always reactive and in self-defense. Now, over the years, we know that this isn't true because we have one racial variations in patterns of domestic violence. So when you say here's what white people are doing in the Midwest, that doesn't necessarily fit how domestic violence in black communities actually look or operate. The etiology is different. The causes are different, right? Because of racism, stress, and poverty, you may have higher incidences of domestic violence among black people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's more patriarchal, right? And the second thing that really kind of did the Duluth model, and at least within the literature, was the rise of family violence or family conflict studies. So the first studies that were done on domestic violence by white people weren't Duluth. They were actually based in sociology and psychology. So people like Strauss and Gels were interested in trying to figure out what were rates of victimization in white and black households. So when they did the National Family Violence Survey in 1975 and they did a resurvey in 1985, they found that women did abuse men. Yeah, in fact, there's a woman named Susan Steinmetz who wrote several articles on the battered husband syndrome. But she says in her biography that she stopped writing it because feminists were sending death threats and threatening her career. So the idea of Duluth was based really on an ideology that Pence herself admits. So, I worked on this chapter for a book specifically on domestic violence in the black community, going all the way back to the 1900s. And you can read Pence's own words where she says, listen, we made this up. This is based on advocacy, and we never tested it across populations. We never looked at different racial groups to do this. I think one of the biggest things that challenged Duluth is the admission of female perpetrators that they're abusing for control and that self-defense is not the primary or the secondary reason that they actually abuse men. So when you look at self-reported motivations among women for why they abused white men in these studies, they say things like anger, want of attention, jealousy, are they've had histories of previous trauma from child abuse? Are they use drugs? Are they alcoholics? So when you're looking at what precipitates female aggression among white populations, you have lots and lots of studies that are investigating why white women commit violence against white men. Now, when you look at black people, you can do a systematic review and not run across one single article that discusses black women's motivation. I think in looking at this for the last 5 years and writing a systematic review on it, I found one article that insinuated that racism and social marginalization may have something to do with rates of female perpetrated violence against men, but they linked it to parenting styles. So they said that if a black woman was single, if she was poor, if she was politically marginalized, and she believed in spanking children, it increased risk for her possibly abusing her male partner, right? I mean, that's a lot of confounding variables there. So the most straightforward answer about why we have violence in our communities and why Duluth doesn't really apply to us is because unlike white people, black people have always had higher rates of bidirectionality, be it in terms of homicide or in terms of violent perpetration. Now remember, and I know this has been floating around the internet for a few days now, when you look at the numbers of intimate partner homicide from 1976 to roughly 1990, black men were the majority of the victims of intimate partner homicide in the United States. That does not happen in any other racial or ethnic group in the country. So there's something uniquely happening among black people that's reproducing what Wolfgang found in the 50s, namely, black women are killing black men at a higher rate. Now, as we proceed, two things happen. Domestic violence in our communities has decreased. So rather than 820 black men being killed per year, now it's down to maybe 150, 200 at max. Whereas black women are around 290, 300, depending on the year. So black men roughly, you can say if you're looking at the supplemental homicide data, black men are roughly 30 to 33% of the victims of intimate partner homicide now. But that trend didn't reverse until the early 1990s. So what Duluth tried to do was try to say all violence is reactive. And what we did is we translated that and saying, well, black men are violent. They're more violent than whites. Hence, they're more violent within households. But none of our data actually shows that. What Duluth does is take an ideological perspective that does not align with population studies or even the studies that are done on Black people and tries to pretend that it's universal. Black men are not raised up in patriarchal households. Black men do not have power over other groups in the United States. And these are the key elements that are driving dominant perpetration and seeking, or males seeking dominance and control within white households that just doesn't fit within our community or our culture.
I want to go back to that because I want to understand something you said earlier. You said that there was a scholar who wrote about battered husbands, and she was basically forced into shutting down her research because of death threats. And I wanted to,
Yes, Steinmetz.
yes, I want to get into what's the process of ideology overtaking data? Because from what you said, and looking at the numbers in this study, it seems like Black men are usually the victims when it comes to intimate partner violence in the household. And as you just said, that they were the highest number of victims of intimate partner homicide. So how does the data get overtaken by ideology? And why are some scholars willing to let that happen?
Well, I mean, it's the same thing with anything within the society, right? How do you convince a whole, generations of people that Black people are inferior, right? If if you don't control the ideological apparatus within a society, then you don't get to determine what's studied within universities. Duluth started because it got funding from various entities to protect white women. And it started at the state level and it gained national attention. In fact, Ellen Pence actually writes an article in 2003 where she's having a debate with Beth Ritchie about the criminalization of Black women due to white feminist policies around domestic violence. And she says, look, basically, I'm sorry that this leads to racist policies that conservatives use for their own end, because the conservatives say, well, look, if we're going to have mandatory arrest, we can use this to criminalize Black and brown communities, which is what they did. And Pence was like, well, that wasn't the original intent of what we aim to do. But sorry, Beth Ritchie, that's what the Republican and right wing legislators in various states decided to do. So once you get to the point that white feminists are writing about race and racism, and they're following the trends from the 1970s forward around the need for women to be centered as victims, you're not going to have a lot of people, especially among Black people, that are able to resist the full force of that. Now, if you look at early work by Black people like Paula McLean, like she's writing about the motivations that Black women have in committing homicide against Black men, and she used like big city data like Chicago, and she flat out says, she's like, look, the major motivation here is jealousy. Some of it's in self defense, but Black women in general who kill their partners believe that if a Black man beats them, they have the right to kill them, right? Um, that's just the way that people were writing about this issue. So that lent itself for feminists to say, well, listen, women are the primary victims. We don't have to look at Black people as a test case. We'll look at patterns of violence in white communities. And we're growing feminism within academy, and women and gender studies is proliferating throughout Black studies. It's through every liberal arts discipline. So data doesn't become something that they're fundamentally interested in. It's about the advocacy of social justice, which in that case was seen to be advocating for women and their vulnerability to men, even when the evidence didn't suggest that. So again, what I'm pointing to is white people had the power to define what the ideology was and the platform or the background of the debate. Family violence conflict scholars were constantly arguing against feminists, but feminists controlled the ideological pull and moral sway of this argument. Black people were never considered. So people like Bell Hooks, even the early work by Patricia Hill Collins, would just say, listen, we know that Black men are patriarchs. So what we're going to do is we're going to take Duluth, say it's an issue of male dominance, and then say because Black men are patriarchs, they use domestic violence to compensate for them not being patriarchs. And this is an argument that you see developing in real time in the early 1980s. So ideology, even within universities, has the ability to frame where research goes. And we see this in real time right now. I mean, part of the crisis that's happening in the United States under Trump is that you had an ideology of liberalism that's been pushed by leftists and Democrats about race relations, racial representation, etc. And you've had our administration just rip all the resources from them. So the issue really isn't were liberals right about racism, because since Trump's got into office, he showed you that white liberalism and humanism and integrationism is wrong. But that was the dominant ideology because that was being funded. It's the same thing with domestic violence research. Black people are not getting huge grants to write about Black people's prevalence rates of domestic violence or create new theories. People who are saying domestic violence in Black communities happens because of men, they get funded off of the agendas of white feminism. The people who are saying that Black men are more violent because they're compensating, and this is what's reflected in the literature, those are the people that are becoming more able to get funding for their projects. It's the issue about who's rewarded for what kind of ideology they hold. Has nothing to do with research, has nothing to do with the truth. And that's why I say that what I've been so disappointed by is how we're supposed to have all these Black pundits trying to give us different ideas or different information about why certain things keep happening to Black people and Black populations. Now they're just repeating the talking points that you would learn in a Black Studies or Women and Gender Studies 101 course. There's no analysis of prevalence. There's no attempt to reconcile high rates of male victimization, at least in terms of physical, psychological, verbal, and non-lethal physical aggression. There's no way, they're not talking about female-initiated violence. They just want to say, hey, a woman hit a man, a Black man, so it doesn't matter. Or, and this is what I think is even more dangerous, they'll say that it's not injurious. It doesn't harm Black men, right? So there's no reason for us to attend to it. Both of those are very dangerous, and both of those don't do anything to decrease violence in our communities.
All right, before we move on to the next part of the conversation, we got a question from the audience for Dr. Curry. And the question is the Duluth model the basis for Bell Hooks' compensatory masculinity and the general idea of Black males are surrogates of white patriarchy?
No. The Duluth model is an argument about patriarchy and white men having control in a society. That means they want to have control within a household. Bell Hooks adopts that view, but she doesn't develop compensatory masculinity. Compensatory masculinity was part of the argument that white advocates in the domestic violence and shelter movement were having to say, hey, Black men don't have any power. So, how do we understand how they're able to participate in patriarchy? So then you have white feminists say, oh, let's say, based on what's happening in criminology, looking at people like Minutim Amir and Wolfgang and Franco Ferracuti, well, maybe Black men have a compensatory masculinity, meaning that because they are not patriarchs and can't have power in a society, maybe we say that their poverty, their lack of education, etc., makes them compensate with violence for what they can't get in social capital. And what you see in early Black feminist literature, and you see this specifically in Patricia Hill Collins' work, right? They'll say, oh, Black men want to dominate like white men. They can't. So domestic violence becomes the way that they try to do this. This was actually one of the first formulations that you found within intersectional theory, specifically Kimberly Crenshaw's Mapping the Margins in 1991, because she actually has a small section in that article where she says racism is connected to patriarchy because Black men are trying to attain patriarchal power, but racism has mean that they actually lack the ability to do so. So that's how domestic violence happens. It's Black feminists that took up this kind of compensatory view from criminologists and utilized it to explain how Black men who don't have any structural power are driven psychoanalytically to compensate for that lack of structural patriarchal power through violence against intimates. And the irony of this is that both in Schechter's book on violence against women from '82 and William and Holmes' book on the second assault, both say in bold print, there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever for these theories. So Bell Hooks is restating a principle of Duluth, but when she gets to Black men, she'll say that they're trying to do it for domination because they aspire to be white men, which is more of a compensatory framework than a straight traditional Duluth argument.
All right, thank you for that answer. I want to get into something that really concerns me. because if you look up in the Jumbotron, I published an article on Monday called Pain is Love. It was basically about the Sha'Carri Richardson situation, but it was more about the response that a lot of people had to that incident. And this is something that I've seen quite a few times just out in the daily world and just in general, where you'll see a woman attack a man, sometimes violently attack a man, sometimes kill a man in a domestic violence incident, and it's almost brushed off, not so much by feminists, but by other men. There's almost like this mentality among a lot of men that, you know, that's just how she is, or if she didn't hurt you, just shake it off and just either leave or just keep it moving on and just don't pay attention to it. And I think that speaks to a very dangerous mentality, because you have men who are basically, in my opinion, accepting their own abuse and downplaying their own abuse. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this, because I have a theory about it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Well, listen, there's a few different ways to approach this problem. And the reality of the situation is, this is enabling extremely dangerous behavior, right? A few years ago, or maybe a year ago, when we start talking about child abuse, specifically, I work on child physical and child sexual abuse. You saw the same kind of excuse making, that sometimes it was men that were rationalizing that, oh well, he had sex when he was 9. It had no effect on him because he's a man. I always find it strange that you have those groups of men that make that claim, and then they claim that they're progressive because they say other men can't express their feelings. But part of expressing the feelings and understanding injury and harm is recognizing oneself as a victim. And what you keep seeing is this victim blaming and victim denialism among pundits, especially, that say, well, if it didn't hurt you, then it's okay. And again, this uses physical injury as the criteria by which something is dangerous. And we know that's not true. We have years of studies going even back to the doll test with Kenneth Clark, showing that racism is in fact dangerous because it affects the psychology and self-image that Black people have of themselves. Yet, when we are talking about Black men as victims, we don't believe that having an abusive partner that constantly says that you're worthless, says that you'll never amount to anything, that pushes you around, threatens to call the police on you, threatens to kill you, doesn't somehow harm our mental and spiritual well-being. Uh, the question of why these men say that, I honestly think is for visibility, because no other group is spoken about in that way. And I want to be really clear on this point, because remember, even among Duluth Model feminists, part of the argument is that domination and control don't simply have to be based on physical abuse, financial abuse, verbal abuse, psychological abuse, etc. Right? Manipulation through trying to hold away children. These are all things that we recognize women and other sexual minorities, especially, go through. Especially when you're talking about lesbians, because they have high rates of psychological abuse, right? Reported within the literature. But then suddenly, when you get to Black men, none of that material or none of that reality matters anymore, right? None of that victimization matters. So I think that people do it because it makes them seem progressive, because you're able to say that and you're able to still advocate for women. And I'm not advocating for anybody in my work. I advocate for visibility of male victims. But I understand that Black men and Black women are victims of intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide disproportionately compared to whites. So, in order for us to decrease violence, we're going to have to start using science and stop using tropes and rhetorical quotes from bell hooks to really get behind why this phenomena happens in our communities. And furthermore, in the Sha'Carri situation, why she felt comfortable doing this in public, right? Like, to me, that's the criminally insane part of these arguments, that they'll say that, well, it didn't hurt him, or nobody needs to be confined or arrested, etc. But you're looking at a person doing this in public in a federal airport, right? And the person is completely comfortable with it. So as a perpetrator, you have to think about what Richardson is actually capable of doing in private. And in that situation, like I said, I'm not a big fan of carcerality, because locking Black people up doesn't seem to decrease domestic violence. But this person needs therapy, and they need to be removed from the person that they're abusing, which is in that case her boyfriend. These people who are pundits that are saying this, it's either some kind of denialism, or is this a straight up indifference or hatred of black male victims? The public sentiment is not even carrying that way, where we believe that the only way or the only harmful abuse is physical injury. We have to start looking at the mental effects and the psychological effects that black men are enduring with abusive partners.
I wanna put this idea I have out there, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. I have a theory that a lot of black men, even if we take out the pundit class and we take out everybody who has a platform or a mic, just in general, I have a theory that a lot of black boys grew up being hit and being verbally abused by a lot of their mothers. Like every time they ask a question, they are told to shut up. You know, every time they try to question the world the way children do, they're told to be the hell quiet and sit down and this sort of stuff. And I think these young boys grow up to be men who accept abuse and almost see it as a love language. What do you think about that?
I think that's certainly plausible. I mean, you have to remember that the kind of physical and emotional abuse that we're talking about follows black men over life course, right? I mean, Cascardi's had a study where she talks about uh, black boys in sixth grade being hit and abused by some of their first girlfriends, their first crushes. We see this early within black boys being abused by mothers. But you know, abuse. I mean, it's tricky. The only thing that I would say that's tricky about that explanation is we don't necessarily always know the perpetrators, right? So we know that female caretakers abuse black boys at much higher rates than men. But some of the most impactful stories of abuse may happen, you know, on the basis of fathers and not mothers. We don't know the specificity of that, but it's certainly plausible to say that black men who are adults don't see the abuse as a relationship ender because they've been socialized by their childhood trauma to accept abuse as either normalized or, as you say, as a love language. But again, this is why we need studies specific to black people. I am sick and tired of people waking up and never reading an article on domestic abuse beyond what Bell Hooks says, trying to give us a serious analysis of black male victims. Black men and black boys are suffering both in terms of female perpetrated violence in middle school forward, and they're suffering from child abuse. And we're not having a conversation about that. So when we see something like the Richardson case, we fall into the same patterns of indifference. It does not humanize or help black men to say that their abuse is laughable. It doesn't help us to say that we're only going to pick injury as the standard so that we can criminalize black men. Because if he would have hit her and knocked her out, like in the Ray Rice situation, I can guarantee you that all these pundits that say that domestic violence doesn't matter and that it didn't harm anybody will be up in arms talking about the need to talk about masculinity, right? We are being dishonest as a people, and we are continually basing our sentiments, our opinions, and our observation of problems within the black community on ideology rather than facts. And that's why these people and these pundits are getting platforms, because you cannot make me believe that you've been looking at data, that you've been looking at case studies, hell, that you've even talked to black male victims, right? Even in the studies we've done where we've talked to black male victims, you don't get those stories. So the dishonesty for people with platforms and people who want to deny this in the actual lives of black men comes from a bad faith position. Because there's no way that you can say that black men are not being harmed as little boys or in adulthood by various forms of violence, intimate violence, be it by their mothers or their partners.
All right, Dr. Curry, let's talk solutions. How do we fix this?
Well, we need to be honest about it, right? So we need people that are going to be serious about studying these issues and passing policies that are addressing the roots of that. Uh, Two things that we know are correlated to escalation and injury. That's going to be alcohol, right, between partners, and combative relationships. So if black men are saying that they're victims, we need to pay attention to that. If black women are saying they're victims, we need to pay attention to that. And those people need therapy and help. They need conflict resolution. There's lots of research that shows that locking black men up or black women doesn't work because they go back to each other. So that means that we have to take a fundamentally different approach than the Duluth model. Our culture, and this is even the work of Oliver J. Williams, right, shows that we have to take different ways to get black men both through treatment programs and to start getting black women into domestic violence treatment intervention programs. We got to decrease the alcoholism among these cultures. I mean, among these couples, right? We have to make sure that these couples are actually sticking to programs that are going to de-escalate and take them out of the conflict zone, so to speak. And lastly, we need to start getting people to change the ideology, man. A lot of this is driven by poverty. Like when you just control, if I mean, it's driven by poverty so much that when you control for class, the racial disparities disappear. Multiple studies say that, right? Even Carolyn West, and she advocates for asymmetrical bidirectionality, right? Because she's focused actually on injury. But even she concedes in her works that once you control for class, racial disparities disappear. So poverty is a major driver of this. Unemployment for men. If the man is unemployed, that increases his propensity to be abused by the woman. We have years of data on this stuff. It's just that the people that we're speaking to that are getting the microphone and who are influencing policy and opinion makers are not having that conversation. And we have so many problems going on as a people in the United States right now that it becomes disingenuous to let this kind of violence that's happening in our relationships and homes that are breaking up couples that are going to socialize children of the next generation into violence be handled by people that can't pick up books or actually study the types of things that we need to do to actually decrease violence in our communities.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Curry. I know there's a lot of people who have a lot of questions, and I know you have your time is short. Do you have time to do a brief Q&A with maybe 2 or 3 people?
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool. If anybody has some questions for Dr. Curry, now's your chance. Put your hand up in the request. I'll let you speak for a brief minute. Ask Dr. Curry some questions, and then we'll move on to the next person. So if you want to speak, now's the time. While we're waiting for people to put their hands up, what are you working on right now, Dr. Curry?
Oh man, I'm working on a few projects. I just came back from Remembrance Day here in Scotland, talking about colonialism and slavery. So it was a really it was a really heavy conversation. But I'm actually working on. I've just finished a piece on domestic violence for the last that looks at prevalence rates over the last 100 years. That centers black male victimization. So this conversation is really timely because I've just finished going through practically every national survey set that we've had. I've gone back through the ethnographies that we've had in the early 1900s. And I think that it's time for us to just become more honest about how we talk about problems within our own group. My next chapter is looking at prevalence rates of child physical and sexual maltreatment. So I'm going through the child maltreatment data, and I'm looking at prevalence rates of that, seeing what's behind those issues.
All right. Let's see who we got here. We got Brother Fresh is somebody I know. He's been in my spaces before. Hopefully he can pick up the mic and ask Dr. Curry a question. Let's see. Fresh, you there? He may be having some trouble with his mic, so let's keep it moving. I see Dr. Gaskew's in the building. How you doing, brother? It's always good to see you in the spaces, man. Let's see. Here we go. I think he's up there. All right. All right, Fresh, you have the microphone. The microphone is yours. What you have for Dr. Curry?
Doesn't sound too crazy. Let me know.
No, you sound good. You're good.
All right, appreciate you. How you doing, doctor? I was
I'm well,
listening. You
sir.
had a lot of great information, and me and brother Torraine, we have a lot of great conversations, and he really waves the flag of great information on this side of Twitter. One question I have, because when this whole
Mm,
Sha'Carri situation went down, it's an unfortunate situation. I had a dialogue or a discourse with a gentleman on the timeline, and he was one of the gentlemen, like you just explained, right, who doesn't believe if there's no great physical violence that a man is not a victim, one, and then two, his conclusion was that men are just inherently more violent. And my conclusion, what I told him was to counter that, I said, I don't believe men are more violent than women. I believe we have the same propensity. I think efficacy is what he's arguing, right? Like, because if you
mm,
look at any combat sport, women permeate all the same combat sports men do. I think it's just
Hmm.
efficacy, right? If you talk about physicality and things of that nature, as what you were talking about, like the physical nature of it, but they don't take into account the mental, the spiritual nature of how you're affected by abuse. And that was my argument towards him, like because as someone who is formerly a social worker, I've seen this both anecdotally and professionally
Hmm.
that I believe both men and women have the same propensity for violence, but efficacy is what's argued because men, in terms of physicality, possess more.
Yeah, I mean that's a perfectly reasonable explanation. I mean, it depends. I've said this for years, and it just goes past people, with degrees of liberal arts. It goes over their heads. It's a question of what you're measuring. So if you're measuring homicide, then yeah, men tend to be more violent. But when you look at male homicide, the propensity is for men to kill strangers. If you're looking at who's more likely to kill someone they know are intimate, women by far tend to kill intimates at a higher rate than men do. So it's a question of what you're measuring. Now, if you're just talking about overall violence, well, I mean that's in part based on socialization, right? You put men in wars, you put men in conflict, you have societies where you need men to be socialized into violence to protect the overall group. There's a historical reason for that, especially on imperialistic societies that we find, throughout white societies in the United States and Europe. But if you're just talking about the capacity of an individual to manifest violence against another individual, then yeah, I think women had the propensity to be just as violent as men. There's nothing that stops that. And the studies of intimate partner homicide, as we just talked about briefly, demonstrate that while there's racial variability in that, men and women are capable of killing an intimate. So it's just a question of how you analyze the prevalence of a group in doing that, and trying to make a generalization. But nothing you said about to this person who disagreed with you is incorrect. I would say to them that, again, be specific in terms of what you're measuring. If you're talking about homicide, you may have more grounds to win that argument. But if you're just talking about the propensity or capacity of someone to do violence, that's not necessarily true. And you have to think about the violence that women do to children, right? Like by far, right, that exceeds men. So again, it's a question of what you're measuring and what area you're actually talking about.
Thank you, sir, because that was absolutely my conclusion with him, and he never answered it. But I was really moved to ask you that question, kind of for confirmation, because when I had that conversation with him, I was like, I'm really thrown off how the brother doesn't understand this. But you kind of explained it, how he doesn't see himself, and I told him that I was like, you don't think men can be victims
Yeah.
unless they're dead, like you don't think a man can be a victim.
Yeah, brother. And one of the things that in one of the talks I gave years ago, I said, one of the mistakes that we have, especially around black men, is we assume the only thing that can harm a black man is a bullet. So we assume that the only injury that happens to black men surrounds death. When it comes to child abuse, when it comes to child sexual assault, when it comes to intimate partner violence, none of those things matter. And that's why when I wrote The Man Not, I announced all these other issues because I said that it is not sufficient to pin black men's life worth down to a number. It's kind of why I laugh when people say I'm a positivist because I'm criticizing the ability of us to try to understand black men simply through the brute numbers of their deaths. Count how many black men died this year. Okay, that's all we need to know. When you start taking into consideration how black boys suffer, say, at the hands of their mothers, and then suffer from intimate partner violence at the hands of their first girlfriends in middle school, and then suffer when they're in college, and then experience this as adults, right? You see these antecedents of violent socialization happening across their life course. And instead of us having a conversation about, hey, how are these other forms of violence influencing black men, right, to do something like commit serious harm or commit murder, we say it's all because of their masculinity. But then when we look at murderers, what do we see? High levels of trauma, high levels of child abuse, high levels of poverty deprivation, and like ostracization from hugs, emotional support, etc. Right? They don't follow the path of their own evidence. Everything becomes based on what about men instead of, well, how does different conditions socialize disproportionately men to do ththese kinds of things? And I again, this is the function of ideology. Because when you talk about white people, you can't do this. Like, I don't get to go talk and say, oh, white men are just these beasts, etc. But you'll have someone in the audience say, well, what about this evidence? When it comes to black people, and somebody says that, nobody says anything. And that's the difference of how we're socialized to understand this problem. we've internalized the fact that we think that black men are violent. So we think that the feminist explanations make sense. But then when you have someone like me that says, well, look, I've looked at the history of these theories and let's go through the data of it, all you can say is, well, I disagree, or I don't think black men are violent, or, you don't care about women. The issue is if we start caring about our communities, we can't overlook the data. The issue is men and women suffer. Children, boys and girls suffer. How do we decrease those rates of suffering generally? So yeah, I think your response was fair to the gentleman you were arguing with.
Dr. Curry, I wanted to ask you about that because as somebody who like studies media and pays attention to a lot of this language and some of this messaging, I feel like a lot of that messaging that you're talking about has kind of worn out its welcome. I think some of it's tied to the fact that the political landscape has shifted in America. I also think that some of the people who were pushing a lot of that rhetoric were basically so shrill and they were so removed from reality that people who would even could be considered anti-black misandrists won't even support that now, because I see a lot of people who tried to get purchase off that over the past 4 or 5 years. I don't know if their funding dried up or just the people who are what they would normally sell that to aren't buying it anymore. But it feels like that rhetoric is starting to go away, not entirely, but it's not getting the sort of purchase that it used to maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Do you think that's true in the academy?
Yeah. I certainly think it's true. I mean, I'm never on Twitter as much as some of my students and colleagues are. But I see people pushing back, and for better or for worse, I think that one of the things the man not did, when so many people are talking about it, is that it actually showed the numbers of victimization, and there's only so far you can run when you have the data in front of you. So I think a combination, at least on the academic side, from people participating in Twitter, like constantly using data now to talk about intimate partner violence. And as you say, I think a lot of the funding has dried up for the liberal conversation that were pushing these things. I mean, a few years ago, you had people like Jamelia Lemieux and these other people trying to say that black men were the largest killers of black women due to intimate partner homicide. And they were getting that from that speech that Holder gave, I think in 2009. But even in the Department of Justice website, they had to take it down because it was inaccurate. And this is what I mean, right? Is that you could have someone like Eric Holder say black men are the largest killers of black women, because of intimate partner homicide, which is just completely not true. Because intimate partner homicide is a subset of homicide, so you have to look at whether or not their initial relationship of homicide was based on strangers or intimates, and there's just not enough numbers to get there. So you have him make that claim. Nobody thought it was an issue. I remember when I heard it, I was actually writing the man not. And I went on Facebook. It's like, this is bullshit. There's no way that this is true. And I just posted the data. And people were still, even when they saw the data, were still like, well, I think we should show solidarity. It's like, I don't show solidarity for things that are false. Right. So I think today, what you have are people who are more familiar with the data. And as you say, don't have the strong ideological allegiances, right, to this kind of identity politic where you could just say black men are the boogeyman for everything without somebody now responding. So I think that's part of the reason that we've seen some of this. But I mean, I'll be honest with you, man. Especially being here in Europe, they have no idea because they don't have racially disaggregated data sets, so they don't have any idea that this conversation exists. They're still stuck in the 1980s. So we have a lot of work to do as black people to actually change the conversation and try to create clinicians and institutions, right? Like domestic violence hotlines for black and brown men, right? For racialized men who experience these kinds of female perpetrated violences or bidirectionality. We need people trained in social work and counseling that could deal with that population. But right now, what we're doing is we're starting to question it, but we don't have solutions because we don't have the personnel that's familiarized enough or familiar enough with male victims to actually treat this. And that's why I said we can have the conversation on social media. We can win the argument. It's not like a black feminist is going to be able to come up and say with all the data you're wrong. They're going to say I just choose to believe something different, and that's fine. But in terms of what we think in terms of diagnosing and treating this issue, whether or not we have therapists, that's where the rubber meets the road. We don't have enough of those people on the ground that's in our communities that can help victims, be they male or female, that don't reproduce this problem.
All right, thank you, Doctor. We got 2 more speakers, and then we'll shut down the Q&A. We're going to go to Ricky, and then we'll go to Dr. Tony Gasky. So, Ricky, you had the floor. What's your question for Dr. Curry?
What up, Torraine? What's going on, Dr. Curry? You know, I
Hey,
read
sir, how are you?
I think it's one of the most important books we've ever had written in the Black community.
No,
Great
thank you,
piece of
sir.
work. Absolutely. So my question for you is this. When we talk about this issue, when we deny the bidirectionality, if you look at what our sister, Sha'Carri Richardson, what she said, like him just being a man, uh, he's obviously guilty. She can never be guilty. She can never be wrong.
Mhm.
Doesn't that kind of encourage the violence? And I think that's what we do as a community when we say that it's always one side. It's always the man. I think that exacerbates the situation and it encourages, the narrative.
No,
I think
absolutely,
we need to change
absolutely.
that. Yeah.
No, listen, brother, I wholeheartedly believe that because we have we have some evidence. I don't want to say tremendous evidence. I mean, we have tremendous evidence if we're talking about white people, but even with black people, we have tremendous evidence that are enough evidence to show that the denial of aggression on behalf of women actually empowers them to utilize police and other administrative systems against black men. And that's what I meant when I said that there's a different kind of vulnerability with black men because of the racism and specifically the misandric aggression directed towards them. So if like just think about Sha'Carri's situation. Like I saw the other part of the tape when they were when they were taking her in, when they were arresting her. And as you said, she made the comment, well, he's the man and I want to press charges against him. So if there's always displacement of victimization where the woman is always the victim and the man is always the perpetrator, that empowers women, especially in this case, black women against black men, to utilize those kind of criminal justice systems against black men. That means that if you're a black man on parole and she abuses you, but she convinces them that because you have a record that you're the abuser, you could get locked up again. It means that if she's upset with you and she calls the police on you, right? It could lead to you losing your life. The dynamics change. So coercion and control can look differently among black people and have much graver consequences for black men than if you just did that among a white population. So yes, I think it's a form of domestic violence and abuse that women exercise over black men that we don't talk about enough. And it's not really well represented in the research either. On the other hand, too, and this is why I was when I was looking at what's his name, Mark Lamont Hill's piece on Bud on Joe's show, I thought that somebody needs to say something about that because we don't look at the vulnerability. Like I agree that we shouldn't appeal to carceral solutions. But if you say, okay, people should go their own ways, but you don't take in consideration in the first point that police are paying attention and that a black man's involved, it ignores the victimization and the vulnerability that man has in relationship to the state. And domestic violence has been made into a criminal justice issue because of Duluth model feminists and mandatory arrests. So we have to think carefully about what this looks like among our own population. And we haven't done a good job of that. So yeah, I agree with you. It perpetuates the situation, but I think more so than that, we haven't paid attention to how police involvement and claiming that the black man is always the perpetrator actually leads to these kinds of outcomes where black women can punish black men basically and control them through police.
All right. Last speaker, we got Dr. Tony Gaskin in the building. Dr. Tony, it's a pleasure to have you in the space. You're always a good friend of the shows. What's your question for Dr. Curry?
Well, first, of course, fantastic space, Torrin, and you have in Tommy clearly one of the most brilliant scholars on the planet. Uh, Sharing this information is vital. The only thing that I'd like to really interrogate with Tommy is, as we know, as we approach almost 32 years of the Violence Against Women Act,
Mhm,
we still are no closer to understanding the IPV to prison pipeline for
mhm,
black males. And it's very difficult to not point the dirty stick at the Black Academy because we know about this. We refuse to interrogate the data the facts, and just imagine. And my question, Tommy, is what impact do you think eventually, if we begin this uh, this reign of empiricism on the IPV to prison pipeline, where do you think this is going to lead at the end of the day?
For black academicians?
Yeah.
Oh no, man! I mean, I think I said this in my book. I think this is a class war, brother. I think because there's no way that you have so many people with PhDs in fields like sociology, anthropology, etc., and we don't get this right? Because it's like you said, you can literally see the debates where white feminists are responding to black feminists saying, "We're sorry, we're locking everybody up." Right? Because the black feminists like Beth Ritchie saying, well, look, your mandatory arrests have led them to go in black communities, see that black women are abusing black men, and then locking these black women up. So that's why she's writing about, right? That's why all her books were about, well, black women are defending themselves and they get punished right through arrest. I disagree that it's all self-defense, but that's a different issue. We both recognize that disproportionately black women are arrested, right? And nobody's saying anything about that because they're still trying to encourage the path of thinking that aligns with liberal feminism. If we go start going on the evidence and start looking at the history, like I said, we have evidence for the last 100 years that black men have been victims of intimate partner violence and intimate partner homicide, then the whole argument falls apart. And it's like Elaine Brown says in the condemnation of Little B, you start exposing these kind of black elites for their condemnation and their war on poor black men. And I think I mean, this is the same thing that Anthony Lamell said about black studies. He wrote an article about black studies and mass incarceration and said that the more black men they lock up and the inability of Africana studies to deal with that phenomena means that Africana studies would be complicit in suggesting that the reasons and the legitimacy of locking up black men were going to be endemic to the black male population. So you would see black people in black studies writing about black men being pathological and criminal. And sure enough, that's what we find, right? So yeah, I think that if we take this empirical bend, it's black people correcting other black people, and I think it ultimately leads to a disintegration, if not a major divide, that's even sharper than now between black academics. But I think it's the right thing to do. I don't think that we should be complicit or complacent concerning the dishonesty by which we've encountered this issue, because it actually has cost people their lives, right? I mean, imagine if a black scholar is called in as a witness, right? A black feminist scholar is called in as a witness about a black man who's a victim of abuse. Would they say that he's a victim? What would be their resources for doing so? If they don't believe in empiricism, then all they're stuck with are the ideologies of people like a Patricia Hill Collins or a Bell Hooks or Kimberly Crenshaw. And all of them talk about black men in a compensatory and pathological way. There's far too much to risk in creating crops of experts that are ideologically parallel, that they all think the same thing. That's not scholarship. So yeah, I think it's class warfare, or certainly a civil war between black academics.
All right, we got the final scholar. We got one last speaker that came in, just coming in on the end. This is Myron. Y'all know him as A. Beasy. He's another Black male studies scholar. He's a real brilliant brother. Hey, what's good, brother? How you doing?
Hey, just enjoying the conversation, man.
Yeah, you got a question for Dr. Curry?
Yeah. I mean, while he was talking about class war and the criminalization of men through the state, I wanted to ask about what he thinks about, this discourse of black femicide, given the topic of domestic violence. So it's often said that, it may be bidirectionality in the perpetration of non-lethal violence, but when it comes to intimate partner homicide, that there's a black femicide occurring, that black women are killed every 9 or 12 hours or something like this, and that in order to remedy this, we actually need a more well-developed criminal justice system to protect black women from lethal state violence. I mean, personally, I think it's dangerous, but I would love to hear Dr. Curry talk about the empirical validity of a position like that and what he thinks the implications of that could be. as Black scholars
Well,
spreading this type of narrative.
I mean, I think it's dangerous, right? I mean, I'm assuming you're talking about thread count work. So I think it's extremely dangerous. I mean, there's 44 million black people, or almost 45. So black women would be 23 million. Of that, you probably have 12 million adults. I mean, in the supplemental homicide record, you have 300 female victims on the high end. I don't know how that's femicide. So if I'm just controlling for adults, because I'm assuming because she talks about intimate partner homicide, so it's only measured for people in the data between 18 and up. So if I'm talking about adults, I'm talking about 250 to 300 people a year, right? Um, I don't know how that constitutes femicide because black men would be killed around 150. You have, I mean, the numbers don't work out. So no, I mean that's less than half of a percent. No, I just, this, and I say, I've read that literature, and I've never understood why they just don't, because I don't know what the threshold is for someone like a Threadcraft, right? If you're saying that there's a disproportionate rate of homicide, then was there an androcide that happened to black men when 820 of them were being killed in 1975? And I don't know the stake of that. So I don't think it's an empirically substantiated argument. I've never seen any data that black feminist scholars have used to substantiate that claim. And you're talking about a difference of 100 people. So if you say, okay, well, the standard death ratio for black men and black women is roughly 1.5, right? 1.5 person for every one black man that's killed, 1.5 black women are killed. I don't know how you substantiate the claim that there's a femicide where she thinks that only black women or predominantly black women are killed by intimate partner homicide. And again, I'd be happy to have the discussion with her, but I tend to believe, given some of the things I've heard her say about black men, that for her it's more of a theoretical case than an empirical case. The dangers of that discourse, I think, are pretty evident, right? Because if you have people believing that black women are victims of femicide, then I would assume that the predominant, like intimate partner homicide, will be like one of the leading causes of black women's death. But that's not the case, right? Cancer, heart disease, etc., all kill black women in much, much greater proportions than intimate partner violence does. And given the fact that you can basically fit all of the victims of intimate partner homicide in a lecture hall, I don't know what that means to say that it's a dynamic. Furthermore, I think that when you see black feminists utilize that every 9 hours quote, that's a real problem because all they're basically doing is they're saying there's a certain number and then they're dividing that number by hours in a day. That's not how you do stats. I mean, Tony would know much better than I am because he deals with criminology stats. I don't. I deal with prevalence rates. But I've never seen a criminologist report do that. So what we have to be akin to here, what we have to be knowledgeable of here, is we do have disproportionate rates of intimate partner homicide. Since the mid 90s or the late 90s, right, really 1998-ish, the ratio has been skewed towards women, right? So more black women do die from intimate partner homicide than black men. Does that constitute a femicide where black women are solely targeted because they're women? That's not true. And that historically hasn't been true because of the high levels of bidirectionality, not only in terms of intimate partner violence, but also intimate partner homicide. So if you make that argument, say from 2000 forward, maybe I could understand what you're saying if you narrow what your criterion is. But is it true that black women are just being killed because they're women in relationships? That's not true. Not whatsoever. Because again, most of these relationships that black women are going to be victims of violence in are going to be relationships that are based in poverty, where people are making below like 40,000 a year. So I'd be interested in how they can explain class variability. And remember, if you control for class, these disparities go down. So I'd really be interested in how they explain some of this phenomena that they're claiming.
All right, and I think that's where we'll put a pin in it. I want to thank Dr. Curry for coming through, to taking time out of his busy schedule to have this conversation. So much love to him and much respect. Thanks to everybody who came through to listen. We got a pretty good sized crowd in here on a Friday afternoon. Thanks to everybody who wanted to hear some perspective from Black men about the hidden victims of domestic violence. Just one more time, Dr. Curry, can you tell everybody what you're working on and what you're will next be able to see you?
Yes, yes. So, like I said, I'm right now I'm working on child physical abuse and maltreatment. So I'm going to try to historically construct the victimization of black boys under female and male perpetrated abuses during their childhood. I'm working on a lot of different things because I'm trying to write the sequel to The Man Not, and we just published a big report on enslavement and colonialism here in Edinburgh. So my plate's kind of full. But hopefully I'll be able to speak with everybody again next week, and again talk to people about some of the core issues that I think are affecting our communities. And I want to thank you again, Torian, for this because I think it's so important that we actually have scholars that are doing research on these issues, talk to Black people about them. And I know people are never, no group of scholars are ever going to just agree with other people, especially given different political leanings, identity, etc. But I think it's important that we get out the facts and then have the debates off of an evidentiary basis rather than arguing about identity politics all day. Far too many conversations we have thus far have been intellectually dishonest and just clear misrepresentations of the patterns of violence that happen in our community. So hopefully we can correct that with some of these conversations.
All right, thank you again, and thanks to everybody who came through. Dr. Curry, thank you for your time. Just so you know, we're going to be doing this every week. So, like I said, the Black Male Study sessions is something that we're trying to do basically once a week, so we can have these conversations about issues that affect Black men. We'll have another one lined up as soon as we get scheduling together. I'll put it out so you can come through and check that out as well. And this series of talks is sponsored by the African American Men's Historical Society. The AHMIS is a Black American men's intellectual society focused on the preservation of the history and empowerment of Black men. Go to amhis.org to learn more and also visit their Substack. And I put the link up in the Jumbotron if you want to learn more about the organization. And that's where we'll put a pin on it. This has been the first episode of the Black Male Study Session with Dr. Tommy J. Curry. Thanks to everybody who came out. The video and the audio will be up as soon as this is over, so you can go back and catch some things that you may not have heard. And also, we're going to put some data out into publications that you can go read if there's some of the things that Dr. Curry spoke about during the speech. So thanks to everybody. Everybody have a good rest of your weekend. Y'all have a good night. Peace, love, Black power.